I'm Mike Sirtori. I'm an attorney at Intel Corporation. I support Intel's participation in a lot of standards development organizations and in participation in foundation efforts, and that leads me to open source software. I've been doing that work for over 10 years at Intel. My colleague, Margaret LaBrecque, is here. She'll follow me. She'll introduce herself. Audience participation. Have you seen this type of license before? Have you seen this license? This is a cut and paste from a software license that I found earlier this spring. Right? Anybody seen, have you seen this? A couple of hands have seen this. It starts out as a very simple BSD license, right? The first line makes it look simple. But then the author of this license added some disclaimers and some additional clarifications or additional information, right? They changed the license. The license is not now a BSD 3-clause license. It has some additional terms to it. It's got a disclaimer, right? And it tells you to refer to an intellectual property licensing policy, which has some FRAND patent licensing terms associated with it, right? I don't know about your companies, but our company, Intel, has some software license identification tools, automated tools, and it can't pick this up. It can't realize that this is not a BSD license. Our tools see the BSD 3-clause identifier and move on. So that's something that that we need to be aware of, that this is not really a BSD 3-clause license. Royalty-free open source software. A lot of people think about open source software as royalty-free. They expect it to be royalty-free. They talk about it like it's royalty-free. Royalty-free is kind of a myth in this respect, right? In respect that nothing's going to be royalty-free. You don't know. Nobody can tell you ahead of time that some software is royalty-free. You won't have to pay any software license. You won't have to pay any royalty licenses, right? Because you don't know who might have relevant patents that might be infringed by that software. They might not be participating in your project. So it is a myth to talk about open source software as royalty-free. It's never really going to be royalty-free. But I think that developers and participants in open source projects do have an expectation. It's grown up over time from the nature of the developers, the nature of the work that's been done, and the practices of the development work. That we don't expect the contributors to a project to charge royalties for exactly what they contribute. I may have a patent on something, right? I may be able to charge royalties for it if it infringes my patent. But if I contribute my software to that project, I think it's reasonable for you, the user and implementer of that software, to not expect to pay me a royalty for the thing that I contributed. Audience participation, you recognize that logo, Open Source Initiative, right? The Open Source Initiative is not law. As far as I know, I don't think that anybody ever, maybe there's a group that voted to establish the open source principles, but they have, over a generation or more, established the most broadly recognized definitions of open source software, right? Again, an OSI-approved license is not a guarantee of anything. It's not a guarantee of royalty-free. By the way, I should say there's nothing wrong with any of these licenses. There's nothing wrong with that license that I I showed 2 slides ago, the BSD with that disclaimer. It's a perfectly valid license. It's just not an open source software license, right? It's not an OSI approved software license. And I think that what you get with the OSI approved licenses, and there's a list of, anybody remember, is it like 68, 69 maybe, approximately licenses, closer to 80 now. It increases over time. I suppose it probably doesn't decrease, but the list increases over time of licenses that are approved by the open source initiative. They're not law, but they are the key ingredient that I think that Scott was talking about. They construct that framework that allows the flowers of open source software development process to bloom. And they are really the key. And one of the most important principles of an OSI approved license, they have 10 principles that define what open source software is. And one of the key principles is that the open source software license is the only license that's required, and that no additional licenses are required to distribute or use the software. Just one more slide before I give this mic to Margaret. ONF, I want to apply it to the room, right? ONF has an IPR policy. I don't know if you know about it. I put a link in the bottom of the slide. They have some very helpful FAQs, right? ONF, the software development in ONF proceeds under Apache 2.0. So I am expecting that, at least in the ONF work, you won't encounter the problem that was that the example on the previous slide was intended to identify, right? You're not going to get somebody tinkering with a BSD 3-clause license, but be on the lookout as those things appear.
Okay, so I came into this because I worked on a project, actually, that Mike set up the regime for, and it was a parallel spec development and open source project. And so the two were sometimes done in parallel, and that's sort of how I fell into this discussion. And, you know, in order to preserve the definition of open source as we know it, you know, we're thinking that we may need to distinguish that from open implementations of FRAND-based standards. And so a few terms have been thrown around in circles of people who actually discuss this stuff. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking those people sound like a blast to hang out with, right? And they're down below there. And so I thought we might have a little bit of interaction here before we go to the call to action. I'm going to read these out, and then if you like the term, raise your hand. If you don't like it, don't raise your hand, and you can vote as many times as you like. Okay, disclose source code. And this would be only in reference to FRAND-based standards where you're implementing a portion or the standard in software. And it's an open, collaborative implementation, but it is not open source by definition. Okay, so with that, disclose source code. Not very. Okay, crowdsourced code. Okay, well, I don't think you like any of these. Okay, here's a really pithy one. Modifiable, redistributable source code. Any takers? No? Okay. FRAND published source code. Oh, wow. Well, see, that's surprising. See, I could not have predicted that. Okay, well, good. One thing down. So call to action. Be aware, educate your coworkers, your fellow travelers. If you have an open source forum in your company, maybe take these slides and present it. Or contact us, and we'd be glad to do a telecon and talk with you about it. Join the industry discussion if you feel strongly about these. I know you're working very hard, and there's a lot of work to do in ONF, but if you feel strongly about open source in general, you might feel like this is an important thing to advocate, and it might just be like within your work group, if these types of things come up, you could say, hey, some people presented on that. Let's look at their slides. And if you're interested in that, contact us, because I'm sure we'll be evolving this. And then, we don't have a lot of guidance in this area other than what Mike has provided and Scott, but there is this idea of multi-mode IP from Jamie Clark over at Oasis Open Standards. And what he talks about is, and what other people have actually talked about, there's some Etsy responses that contain language like this. But it essentially says that, for certain FRAND standards, depending on the IPR policy of the SDO in which they're developed, it may be possible to carve out portions of that standard which do not have any IP claims, or for which the members of the SDO give permissions and implement those as open source, like open source under an OSI license, the kind that we like. And so, void of kind of knowing the silver bullet at this point, our recommendation is just, think about modularity. If you're doing implementing a new portion of a standard or implementing an entirely new standard, think about that modularity. And I know that's been a theme all day long here at the conference, is this disaggregation. All right, and with that, I think, let's go to the summary. So I think we've, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but open source software provided under an OSI-approved license should not require any further licenses or encumbrances. And secondly, don't call it open source if it isn't. We're fine with open, as Mike said. Open implementations of standards are just fantastic. But if it's not under an OSI-approved license, and only under that license, then don't call it open source. And with that, I'm not sure if we have any time for Q&As.